This last event is really a joint initiative of the Economics Department of the OECD and the Public Governance Directorate. And I would like to welcome our Chief Economist here, Laurence Boone, who will be moderating this seminar today. The reason why we organized this seminar jointly is because during the COVID crisis, obviously the issues of public trust on the one hand and of the outcomes for the economic recovery have been interlinked to very high degrees, with positive developments and some negative developments and some worrying trends across the globe. Before I pass the floor to Laurence, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker of today, Mr. Angel Gurria, the Secretary General of the OECD, whom I thank for attending this seminar today, but also for his long-term commitment to the issue of public trust. Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elsa. Well, you left the best for last. So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on trust, institutions, and resilience, opportunities for recovery. Never has the issue of trust and the resilience of our economies and institutions been as relevant as it is today. Public satisfaction and trust in our democracies is at an all-time low. The latest Cambridge Global Trust Report 2020 shows that democratic discontent has been on the rise since the mid-1990s. The number of people who are dissatisfied with the condition of democracy in their countries rose by 9.7 percentage points and now standing at 57.5%. So quite above the half of the population. And the results did not improve in 2020, as far as we know. The COVID-19 crisis is expected to exacerbate economic and social inequalities and further erode people's confidence in public institutions. Now, although economies are generally on the mend, the recovery will take time. The OECD projects that global GDP will rise by around 4.2% in 2021. This is the global economy, the world economy, while trade and investment are also expected to recover, gradually, but to recover. Most OECD economies will still be smaller. However, most OECD economies will still be smaller at the end of 2021 than they were before the pandemic. That shows you how bad the hit has been. Economic growth has a key role to play in boosting the confidence of consumers, but it is not the silver bullet that will rebuild trust. The public perception of how governments have responded to recent national and global challenges undoubtedly lies at the heart of this mistrust. OECD surveys found that the responsiveness and reliability of the public sector was the most important determinant of people's trust in government. Now, we're not saying that democracies are failing entirely, but they are under threat. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer, 48% of respondents from 28 countries, including of those 28, there were 15 OECD members. 48% feel that the political system is not working for them. That's roughly half. The mistrust is significant enough to bring about a rise in populism, social unrest, and sometimes deliver perverse political outcomes. In recent decades, we've also seen the rise of new or evolving challenges that are impacting the way the public views democracies, their democracies. These include disinformation and, of course, undue influence. Now, the OECD has been helping governments recover public trust. This webinar is part of an ongoing series that the series is called Building a New Paradigm for Public Trust. And of course, we're aiming to get to the bottom of some of these questions. Let me provide some food for thought by outlining a few perspectives on how the OECD is considering the response to this waning trust in the context of the recovery from the pandemic, from the crisis. First, in the near term, strong multilateral action and cooperation between countries to match the level of ambition of national responses. This will be critical because it's been massive national responses, but still very little coordination, cooperation at the international level. This will be a condition for the success, for example, of vaccination campaigns. Second, we need to make our economies more inclusive and more sustainable. We have seen how during the pandemic, higher levels of trust in government are associated with substantially higher levels of compliance with measures to reduce the spread of the virus. The success of countries' ambitious recovery plans from COVID-19 will therefore depend on the trust that citizens have in the capacity of governments to anticipate future threats and safeguard their long-term interests. And last but not least, we need to really get to the bottom of why people are dissatisfied, why they're discontent, why they take, and then we have to, once we get to the bottom of this, then of course we have to take action to address the challenge. It's a complex picture, but we must continue to ensure the rule of law, integrity, transparency, anti-corruption, fairness, openness in institutions. These form the foundations of well-functioning governments, and they play a critical role in building and sustaining public trust. Oh, dear friends, trust is the essence of our strategies to combat the pandemic. It is also a vital element of our recovery strategies. If we do not take measures to recover public trust in government, large parts of our societies will not participate in the vaccination campaigns, and we will not reach herd immunity. We will therefore be prolonging the pain and the cost of the crisis, not only economically, but also in terms of lives. The OECD will continue to work with governments to help them recover and strengthen that trust by improving international comparisons and promoting the exchange of good governance practices. I'm confident that this effort will bear important fruit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Secretary General, and thanks, Elsa, for the introduction of this webinar, which is part of a series that the Governance Department has organized and which has been really insightful and fascinating. So as you know, trust has been something that is of interest for everybody who's looking into economics as well, not only because it matters for structural reforms, but because, as Elsa and the Secretary General had highlighted, it especially matters in times of crisis. The Secretary General was mentioning vaccine, but you will find the same reluctance when we look at contact tracing across OECD countries. Many people do not want to engage in contact tracing. All the speakers we have today, and I will introduce them in turn. First, have been policymakers at times of crisis and for reforms. So they know both sides of how trust matter. And I owe them huge thanks for agreeing to be with us when they are actually dealing all in their own capacity with the most acute crisis, I think, in the century. And a special warm thanks to Anna Cameron for who it is 1:30 in the morning and for joining us. It's really, really nice of you. And for Alan, who's sipping his coffee, because it's also very, very early in the morning. Having said that, I was thinking that we would ask Sergey to actually open the discussion because Sergey is today an academic, but he's been very instrumental as chief economist of the EBRD to understand the role of trust in reforms. He's also coming from Russia and knows very well how the transition has required a huge amount of trust and how it may have in some instances been reduced. So without this, let me thank Sergey for opening the floor and sharing his insights.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Thank you very much, Secretary General. Thank you very much, Lisa, for introducing this debate. I think indeed this is a top issue right here, right now. This is the issue when trust in government and trust in institution is not just a matter of losing or gaining GDP points, but also about gaining or losing lives. And in that sense, this debate is very timely. So in my opening remarks, I hope you can see my slides. I will talk about a few takeaways from recent research on populism and public trust that can be instrumental in today's environment in 2021. So let me mention that there is a survey that we wrote together with Elias Papagiannou about populism, where we discuss several hundred papers, including 250 papers written and published in the last 5 years since the recent rise of populism, where we look at 4 questions and definitions and measurement of populism, drivers of the recent rise of populism, and also implications of the rise of populism. We also talk about solutions, even though unfortunately we still don't have much evidence on what works and what doesn't work to regain public trust and to stop propagation of populism. Now, in this paper, and I encourage everybody to read this paper, it's just 100 pages, we have a special section on recent research on COVID. That's been an explosion of economics and political science research on the relationship between populism and COVID for obvious reasons, and we already have a lot of evidence that I'm going to mention in a second. Now, let me show you just a couple of slides of the relevant takeaways from this paper. I'm not going to talk about all these questions that I mentioned. I'm happy to take questions later in the Q&A if you have questions, but let me just say that one of the major lessons of 2008-2009 crisis and subsequent austerity that followed in some countries, and I know OECD has worked on this, and Laurence in particular, the implication of that in many countries was decline of trust in national and European political institutions and in the rise of populism. Here I'm just showing you a picture from our paper with Jan Algan, Elias Papagiannou, and Evgenia Passari, where we show a strong correlation, and we actually identify a causal effect between the rise of unemployment rate in European subnational regions and the rise of vote share of populists in those regions. And the magnitudes are large. So if unemployment before and after crisis goes up, after the crisis goes up by 10% relative to before crisis, you get 10 or more percentage points of vote share of populists going up. Now, the other thing is that that crisis also has probably triggered other factors that have been accumulating, but the crisis has actually awakened, served as an alarm bell for many other players that started to talk about them being left behind, started to talk about cultural divides. And in that sense, crisis was a major point in time where many other things which have been happening under the surface actually came to the surface and caused major fault lines driving the rise of populism. Now, one other thing which I would like to mention is a lot of research has looked at the implications of populism. And here I'm just showing you the GDP numbers. The Secretary General Gurria was talking about GDP growth. And one piece of data that we have is the study of Funke, Solarik, and Trebesh, who looked at performance of populists relative to non-populist counterfactuals. They've done that country by country. They actually show that Brexit, for example, caused a lot of loss in British GDP. But this is the global evidence on something like 60 countries constituting 95% of global GDP. And it shows that once populists come to power, they start to lag behind growth trajectory of potential counterfactual. So before that, you see zero. So before populists come to power, this is a placebo. And then once they come to power, in 15 years, the country lags behind the potential counterfactual by about 10 percentage points of GDP. And that applies both to left-wing populists and to right-wing populists. Now, some people would say maybe they do a better job on quality of institutions, maybe they do a better job on inequality. The answer is no. On average, populists don't improve inequality, and on average, they actually undermine institutions such as rule of law, free and fair elections, and media freedom. I'm not showing you any graphs on this, but you can go to this survey and this study in particular to check it out. Now, one other thing, as I mentioned, is recent research written and published last year about 2020. Now, there is evidence that populist governments were slower to respond to COVID. This is not surprising because populist governments don't like experts. Populists in general don't like experts, thinking that they're part of corrupt elites. And their supporters also didn't take COVID seriously and were less likely to observe social distancing. Now, if you watch pro-populist media, you also are less likely to reduce social distancing. If you lack trust in each other and in government, which many populist supporters do, you also are less likely to observe social distancing. That, of course, leads to morbidity and mortality. Now, there is good news too. Good news from 2020, and here I should say OECD has done an important job convincing the member countries, and here again, Laurence has done an important job convincing the member countries that this is not the time for austerity. Yes, economies are hit. Yes, you have wartime size of budget deficit, but it would be wrong to roll out austerity tools. Vice versa, you have to be generous, especially given that this crisis hits first and foremost those who are left behind, those who are less skilled, those who work in manual work. And this is not just about them losing jobs or incomes, it's about them losing their lives. And in that sense, governments should help, and especially they should help those who are at the in the unfortunate circumstances. And the good news is it's actually good business because interest rates are negative. So being generous this year is actually earning money on borrowing because of the negative real interest rates. Now, once again, let me summarize the implications for post-2020. So what do we know? Well, first and foremost, populists by definition distrust elites, scientists, experts. So it's not surprising that they've done quite badly in handling the pandemic. However, that doesn't mean that this is the last year of populism. A lot of people are celebrating that Donald Trump has lost elections, but we shouldn't forget that he has got a lot of votes. His vote share was 46 or 47%. And in many European countries, populists are still doing well. And there are two reasons for this. One is some non-populist governments have not done a good job and are not doing a good job as we speak. The rollout of vaccination is not functioning well. And the other issue is, even when populists are doing a bad job and non-populist governments are doing a good job, populists may still be convincing, more convincing, especially in online communications. Let me show you a graph from which we discussed in the survey, and it's coming from our paper published this year in Quarterly Journal of Economics, is when Europe has adopted mobile broadband internet, it hit incumbent vote share and it benefited right-wing populists and left-wing populists. The growth of penetration of 3G and 4G in European countries in the 10 years between 2007 and 2018 was a major benefit for populist politicians. So we should not be surprised that they are so far have been more skillful in social media. And in that sense, we should think not only about doing things, but also about explaining things, especially online, especially in social media. So to sum up, what needs to be done? Continue soft monetary policy and general fiscal policy, target those policies for those who suffer the most, especially during the pandemic, do a better job in rolling out vaccination. We are in France, we know that less than 1% of French have been vaccinated so far. And don't forget about communication. Having a product is important. Doing a good job is important, but selling the product is also important. And this is where populists have done an amazing job selling their disastrous performance, especially during 2020, and getting more votes than they deserve. Let me stop here, and I will be happy to take questions if there are questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. It was a fascinating presentation, providing evidence to what some people know intuitively, but the amazing work that you've done with the survey is actually underpinning it, and I think that's essential when we're talking about trust in experts. Let me now turn to Anna, who's Deputy Commissioner for Strategy and Policy in New Zealand. Anna is contributing to inform, collect data, and provide evidence for public service design and reform. And she's also served as Deputy Chief Policy Office at the Ministry of Health. I suspect that everywhere you go, there's a crisis to be solved or some tough decision to make. So we're very much, again, looking forward to hear from you at this early hours. And I think it's important for all of us to learn the lessons from countries such as New Zealand, who's a high trust democracy, and that has managed the COVID-19 pandemic so well. And I'm sure you have a lot to tell you about evolving attitudes and behaviors vis-a-vis public policies during the crisis. So we look forward to hearing your remark. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, and good morning or good afternoon, whichever applies. Great to be here with you today. I speak to you really feeling incredibly fortunate. And the situation that we have in New Zealand in relation to COVID is in some ways quite remarkable. We are now returning from our summer holidays, having had a very normal summer. We have virtually no special measures in place aside from sort of ongoing contact tracing. And last year, we accomplished this partly by having a very strict lockdown, and during that time a very small level of community transmission of COVID, and recorded only 25 deaths in New Zealand throughout the pandemic. So partly some of our good fortune is potentially due to factors of chance, our position as a small country isolated in the Pacific with an island where we can close our borders in a different way to other people. And we're relatively late to receive our first cases, so had an opportunity potentially to look at what was happening elsewhere. But overall, we also believe that the response that we've achieved has partly been due to a higher level of trust in government. And so I can talk a little bit about how we see that as having come through, and how we're not taking that for granted, and thinking into the future about how we would preserve that trust. The previous speaker talked about the change since the global financial crisis, and internationally dropping levels of trust. We haven't seen that in New Zealand. We've maintained levels of relatively high trust. And we see that as due to a number of different factors, and we don't have clear evidence for a single silver bullet, but we do believe there's a number of elements which is common with the OECD's thinking, that there's a two-sided coin in the currency of trust. One is around the effectiveness of public services. Citizens need to be able to see that the services they have are meeting their needs and achieving the outcomes that they want. And particularly post the global financial crisis, New Zealand didn't adopt some of the stricter austerity measures that happened in other countries, and that may have been a factor in relation to delivery of those services. But the other side of that is really that even if people are receiving services, that there is levels of how those are delivered in terms of the legitimacy of public service, the legitimacy of government, focus on integrity. New Zealand has a very strong cultural emphasis on fairness and high levels of integrity expected of institutions. And so that is in some ways the other side required in relation to kind of the delivery of public services in the way go forward. And we had already, even pre-COVID, been taking steps to really shore up how our public service operates to achieve those two things, both in terms of preserving and strengthening the values and principles that underpin how the public service operates, and also in terms of continuing to look at different ways of public services being able to collaborate, being able to connect together in order to deliver better services and focus more on citizen needs. And really in the COVID example, we see that playing out. A number of areas that I would emphasize and what we view as being successful. First of all, we had a very strong mobilization of collective effort and a shared goal. We have obviously a gifted orator in terms of our Prime Minister, but just generally there was a big emphasis on bringing the country together to understand what the single goal was that was need to be achieved: stay home, save lives. And that was very strong and very well adopted across people and well communicated. Alongside that, a very strong emphasis on use of expertise. We had very high profile use of our politically neutral public servants providing advice, and a very strong demonstration of the government showing itself listening to expert advice. And that really reinforced the view that we have these strong institutions, with political neutrality being an element which we recently have put even more strongly into the law as being underpinning how our public service operates. And in the situation of COVID, particularly our Directorate General of Health had a very prominent role in putting forward information and being that trusted source of knowledge. Thirdly, I would mention transparency. We have taken great steps over the last number of years towards open government, and that applied through the COVID process. So all the government adopts a process of proactive release of cabinet papers. So when decisions were made, not immediately, but in the following months, information was being made available about how decisions were taken and how processes were operating. Strong transparency of information about the number of cases. I mean, obviously this was possible because of the low number, but because of the low number of cases, we had information going out about exactly who those cases were, where, well, obviously not for privacy, but maintaining privacy, but saying where people were, how it had come apart, what was the source of the transmission, even information about where certain cases had moved and where, and that was all publicly information and was released on a regular routine every day and in press conferences, and became, you know, was very much trusted knowledge. And in relation to that as well, there was a very clear, very early on, New Zealand adopted the 4 alert level approach, where they talked about different levels of lockdown or alert level, and those alert levels were then have been maintained throughout and been a consistent and transparent what each level meant. And that was released before we went into lockdown. So it was a matter of days because of how fast things were moving, but that was all very clear. Even though it evolved over time and learned lessons, that was all made very clear from the beginning and very transparent, the decisions that were being made about that. Alongside that, I mentioned before that kind of the emphasis that we believe undermines trust around achieving effective services. And throughout the COVID response, we had very strong responsiveness in terms of public services, both in the health system, but also in areas in relation to supporting economic change. So, for example, the government launched a wage subsidy that provided funding for businesses that were unable to operate, and that was delivered incredibly swiftly and on a very high trust model in terms of bureaucracy involved, and that was very well regarded in terms of how quickly businesses reported that they were able to make applications and receive funding the next day. And therefore there was, again, you know, that feeling that the government was there and was supportive through the process. And the fifth element I would emphasize is, again, comes back to those values and principles that undermine public service. Very much the Prime Minister talked about needing to be kind, but also within the public service, we have a very strong emphasis on the spirit of service that public servants bring to their work and the conducting themselves with great sense of respect. And our recent legislation changes have really, again, put more emphasis on that, put the values that underpin those public service of respect and responsiveness into legislation to emphasize that. And there was, well, one example is in the early days of the pandemic, the first quarantine centre that was set up in New Zealand was for repatriated citizens who were coming back from Wuhan, China. And the officials who were involved in setting up that operation, I've heard them talk, and they very much talk about the need to bring those people back and maintain safety for the community, make sure that they were isolated for the appropriate time and that there was no contact with the outside community. But they also talked about having a philosophy of these people being welcomed back to New Zealand and treating these people as though they were their own relatives. And that sense of kindness and respect that in the delivery of services, alongside the kind of obvious focus on safety of the community, I think really is one example of the kind of ethos of how public services delivered, which I believe then contributes to that high level of trust from citizens in when they've received that. So moving forward, I mean, obviously, even though we are in at the moment a relatively favourable position, there is we're not taking this for granted, and we are still obviously impacted in terms of economic position, and there is likely to be in the coming time a constrained fiscal position, and continuing to meet the expectations will be an ongoing challenge. Our focus going forward is to continue to work on some of those areas that we believe will continue to engender trust in those two areas. So in relation to responsiveness, achieving better services and outcomes, we have seen through the pandemic, it's a great example of people working together in a crisis. Agencies were able to collaborate, bring things together and coordinate in a way that they're not always able to do outside of that time. And so we need to continue to work on how our different government institutions come together, how they're able to collaborate, and how they really are organised around citizens and communities rather than around their own administrative needs. And so we're continuing to look at different models for that across a number of different, delivering on different outcomes that we want to achieve. And really harnessing that. People talk about during the COVID pandemic that it was easy to work together because they all had a common goal and they knew what they were trying to achieve. And so therefore we really need to harness that and think, well, how does that apply when there are lots of other competing things happening and it's not so easy to identify that? How do we identify clear goals, clear priorities so that agencies can coalesce together around those? And the other side around trust and legitimacy, we are very focused on a number of areas around really reaching the full range of the population. So in New Zealand, the relationship between Maori Indigenous people and the Crown has an actual strong basis through the Treaty of Waitangi from 1840, but has obviously a long history of difficult relationships, and outcomes achieved for Maori are still much lower compared to other New Zealanders. And so continuing to think about how do we build a stronger Maori Crown relationship into the way our public services run is a very strong focus for us going forward. And also in relation to that, diversity and inclusion, so ensuring that the public service reflects the community it serves. And our recent legislative changes have also underpinned that it sets out that public services should be operating on the principle that public service employment, the workforce should look like the community it serves, and that there should be a focus on inclusion within the workforce. So those are very strong emphasis for us as well in terms of ensuring that pipeline of different diverse groups coming into the public service, and particularly in leadership. We have achieved gender equality in our senior leadership, which across our secretary level, we have over the last couple of years reached comparability even in terms of job size for women, but we have some way to go in terms of other ethnic groups at that level, and that will take a number of years in terms of working. And the other area that we feel we can do more in is around active citizenship and continuing to work on open government. So really thinking about different novel ways of engaging with citizens and how we get people involved in decision-making processes. And we're really only scraping the surface of the potential of that. And I think if we don't continue to develop thinking in that way, in the way that government operates, then we'll end up behind citizens' expectations in terms of involvement in decision-making. So yes, so we're, as I said at the beginning, we are in a fortunate position, but we have a lot to learn. So we are very interested to hear how other people are kind of thinking about issues of trust, and we are continuing to work to preserve the good things that hopefully we have at the moment.
Thank you, and that was super interesting and fascinating. Everybody was just listening very carefully on what sounded a little like a dream story, I must say. So given the time it is for you, I suggest we do a little break here to take a few questions, so that if it comes too late, you can go. I have a couple of questions for Sergey and you, but I would ask participants to raise their hands or type of question in the chat if they don't know how to raise their hand. And also, obviously, Alan, Mario, and Jakob, you're more than welcome to ask questions to Sergey and Anna. One of the things I was wondering is a couple of things. The first one is you've shown the link between trust and populism. I was wondering whether in all the surveys that you look at, Sergey, there was some evidence of the link between trust and how people have complied with the measures. I mean, Anna described to us how New Zealand did this, but is that restricted to New Zealand, or is there a clear correlation between trust and compliance with the measure? And if we take it one step further, since we're also looking at economic consequences, is there a link between trust and the stringency of restrictions to mobility measures that were put in place? And if I go in a slightly other direction, Anna, you mentioned how people listen to experts, neutral politically. So when I think of the difference across countries is communication channels, in the sense that, for example, here you will have round the clock TVs and channel, you know, telling you about how many people are dying and how bad every government is doing. But in some countries, you don't have this type of TV channel of information. It's much more sober, and perhaps learning what it looks like in New Zealand would be helpful in terms of communication and social media. And I have a last question for the two of you, which is about trust and fiscal sustainability. And the reason I'm mentioning this is obviously the better your fiscal sustainability ex ante, the more fiscal capacity you have, not only factually, but also in how the government perceives its capacity to act, which I think is very important, especially in what Sergey was describing. Is there a role can we provide evidence of the role of trust for fiscal sustainability, in the sense of whether it makes government who are very responsible fiscally more free to use the fiscal tool, and conversely, you know, people more compliant with a tax increase or government spending reduction, or conversely, they feel, because they have a lot of trust, they feel the government can spend quite a lot, because at the end of the day, it's not putting in danger their pension, if I put things bluntly. So that would be a few questions from me for you, and I'll check how many participants have raised their hand. Or again, Alan or Mario or Jakob, do you want to ask or comment on the presentation? Not Mario.
Remind me never to be in a panel with New Zealand again. It sounds just outstanding what's happened there. So, and just hitting all the right boxes, but so really well done.
Jakob, would you like to ask something or make a comment? Or?
No, I mean, it's a very impressive story. I'm just wondering to what extent it was important to have seen in other countries, from the perspective of New Zealanders, how things can go wrong. I can certainly tell you from Germany, if it hadn't been for, say, Bergamo, if it hadn't been today, right now, the German government, together with the Länder, sitting together and taking another difficult decisions where numbers are coming down, but we are scared of letting loose the mutants. I think if I would have said the sentence of letting loose the mutants a year ago, people would have thought I'm crazy. They would have never trusted me again. But for us, Bergamo, London, reference points where things didn't go so well, and not because people meant ill, but because in many cases they were simply earlier on in the crisis. So our ability to observe, because we were lucky and a little bit later in the game, did play a role. And I'm wondering to what extent those counterfactuals, if you will, played an important role in the New Zealand story. we certainly didn't do so well as New Zealand, unfortunately. We're in a mess, as most other countries.
I would add something to this question, actually, because nearly all OECD countries had a pandemic plan. And therefore, what happened in Bergamo should have raised the alarm bell across countries. And yet there were very different reactions in, you know, how the people in charge of ringing the alarm bell were heard by a government, or I guess how they rang the alarm bell. But sometimes the channel between the existing pandemic plan and delivering on the plan was, let's say, a little floating. So there must be a question of trust either from policymakers into the civil servants ringing the alarm bell, or the way it was rang, or perhaps into the people reading the data and not really trusting. And we haven't talked about trust between countries. We talked about trust between citizens or towards institutions, but not between countries, and that may have played a role. I don't know if Anna or Sergey wants to jump in the pool with a lot of trust for benevolence and welcoming.
Well, shall I start in response to that? I mean, I mentioned that at the beginning. I do think that New Zealand was fortunate to not necessarily be at the very front line of the pandemic in the early part of last year. So we had a little bit more time to prepare, as you said. It's also, I mean, I think it connects to your kind of comment about the different communication and TV and media that people are aware of. Again, New Zealand is a small country. We have many people who have very strong links to other countries, particularly, you know, the UK, obviously, and other places across the world. And so therefore, people were very aware of the counterfactual of what was happening. And I would say that that's potentially also been a stronger factor, not so much in the early days in sort of March, April, where I think we're more internally focused on how are we addressing that. And there was a lot more doubt in media about, you know, do we really need to be doing this? You know, there were people asking those questions, and, you know, is you know, this sort of mythology of, you know, has Sweden got the right idea? They seem to not be having to do all these measures, these kind of stories going around. But I think certainly as the year has progressed last year, that kind of view of being able to see what was happening elsewhere really strengthened the sense of trust that the government had got it right. And obviously we had a general election in October, and the incumbent government, you know, came back with a huge majority. And I think that really, by that time, that was due to people looking elsewhere. In terms of generally around communication, I mean, I think that was definitely one of the strengths of the response, in the way, the consistency of the government information coming out. We had the Prime Minister fronting pretty much daily press conferences, and at each press alongside the Director General of Health, usually giving the information. And it was very quickly they captured the single source of truth concept. You know, people were not questioning numbers or data, or, you know, those kind of things were accepted and was very transparent right from the beginning. So I think that the communication strategy taken by the government was critical, and is part of the success story.
Lawrence, might I jump in on this question? Because I think both Jakob and Hannah have raised some very good points. I think that seeing what happened elsewhere, and like Germany, Canada experienced the weight of the pandemic a little later and learned a lot from other countries in that kind of interregnum, and that really helped us. There was also a sense among citizens about what was the range of the possible. Seeing the extensive measures occurring elsewhere, I think, opened the way for Canada to have more fully developed measures implemented in our country. I think too that the natural tendency of global citizens to look at what other countries are doing and to naturally compare themselves to what's happening in other countries, you know, like we heard, and from the representatives, we heard around the cabinet table, you know, why can't we have quarantine measures the way Korea does? Why can't we have border controls like New Zealand? Why can't we have a vaccine rollout the way Israel's doing it? So that sort of setting of expectations also plays into kind of the pandemic response and will continue to play into what citizens think is an acceptable response in their countries.
Thank you, Alan. Sergey, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you very much, Laurence, for your questions. I think on this particular format of Zoom, by the way, participants cannot raise hands. They can only talk through chat. I'm not sure though, but.
I've seen a hand.
You've seen a hand, okay. Yeah. So on your questions, yes, there is extensive research now looking at how people comply with restrictions, because in 2020, we have data on mobility. We have Google and Apple data, which are extremely detailed. So you can actually see how people in this city, in this occupation, in this locality, comply with social distancing, how much time they spend in shops, in parks, in workplaces. And so there is substantial research that trust to other people, and especially trust in institutions and government, increases willingness to comply with the social distancing. And of course, most of the research economists do are on the US. This is how economics profession works. And in the US, you have this heterogeneity between Republican states, Republican counties, and Democratic states, Democratic counties. And in 2020, that was especially noticeable when supporters of populist leaders and watchers of Fox News would be more likely to be less trusting the science and more likely not to observe social distance. So this is a big issue. On your fiscal question, I think you're perfectly right. And indeed, if you have fiscal space, it's easier to do what OECD countries did. But even if you don't, you can still do what OECD countries did, right? So if Jakob mentioned that we are now almost in a zombie apocalypse, but we are also in the world where you have double-digit fiscal deficits and packages going to 20%, 30% of GDP. So if you ask that question a year ago, nobody would believe you, depending, doesn't matter whether you're a hawk or a dove in fiscal policy. This is where OECD countries are different, of course, from emerging markets, which have to still pay today very high premium on their borrowing. But there are also oil-rich emerging markets which have built buffers, which came with additional fiscal space to those years, or those months or years of the pandemic. And interestingly, not all of them actually decided to spend money. One country that I would mention, you mentioned that I come from Russia. Russia is a very interesting case. So Russia has a sovereign wealth fund of 12% of GDP, and it decided not to spend it. It actually undertook a fiscal austerity approach. In 2021, it will cut, in real terms, it will cut healthcare spending. It's unimaginable, but this is what happens when you prefer GDP to people. And I know that your forecast for Russia has always been erring on the pessimistic side. And I think the reason for that is OECD's economics department did not foresee that Russian government would decide not to spend, let people suffer from lack of support, and therefore that of course led to smaller decline in GDP in 2020 in Russia. It's just 4% of GDP decline, but a much higher excess mortality than comparable countries. And so this is a very, very sophisticated, nuanced view we need to take of countries with and without fiscal space, the nature of fiscal space, the political institutions. All of these issues are very, very heterogeneous. Now, one final point on pensions. I think when you think about negative interest rates, we should remember that somebody has to pay the cost of that. So if you're a saver, in today's Europe or United States, you're paying the cost of that no matter what. And in that sense, pensioners already pay a cost, but they understand that in OECD markets are not panicking. And in that sense, I don't think we should really worry too much. But we also need to talk to future generations saying, look, in 20 years from now, you will have to work without wage for a month in a year because you need to repay 10% of GDP government debt that we've accumulated this year. And my kids say, sure, because we need to help those left behind this year. And so in that sense, I think there is a big intergenerational justice conversation that is ongoing. And I'm very happy that Hannah was talking about trust and the conversation. And I think we'll have to discuss those issues because indeed the intergenerational transfers that are going to happen are huge. And we still don't know how this will be settled. Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I know we have a couple of hands raised and a few questions, but I suggest we move on to Mario and then Alan and Jakob, and we take all the questions at the end. And first, but thanks, Sergey and Hannah, for this fantastic introduction and the great dialogue that this has created. So let me now move to Mario, who's been in the European Commission for a few years, in charge of various positions, but he's also been at the forefront of first crisis management when he was in the Directorate General dealing with financial markets and how to regulate them, and that's also a question of trust. And he's now in DG reform, and as we were saying earlier, reforms imply losers and winners, and they will be needed in the reconstruction. So again, trust will be a key issue. Mario, I'm not going to read everything that you've done and all the lectures you're giving because that would take too long. But thanks for agreeing to participate, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurence, Elsa, for the introduction. But if you allow me, big thanks to Hannah and Sergey, and Hannah in particular. I will refer to her a few times before I think we allow her to go to sleep, because that is quite fantastic, 2:30 at night in New Zealand.
She's allowed now.
Thank you for the theme. I believe the theme is the theme of trust is at the center of at least 2 or 3 couples that we need to disentangle. The first one, I think, was put very well by Angel Gurria, is the couple between coordination and national ownership of a reform. We heard from Anna a lot about the national ownership of a reform. We know that in less isolated country, you may need more coordination, and that how to solve that equation is clearly one part. The other part is certainly the one you refer to it, Laurence, with elegance, to the fact that it's not the first time we are through a crisis. I mean, the first time you and I met, we were not in an explicit crisis, but was when Europe was just about to introduce the euro, was more than 20 years ago, and then was about to enlarge. And we had the issue of how remain faithful to ourselves with those 2 main changes. So it was not an explicit crisis, but was something that called for us thinking. And then, of course, came the financial crisis. And once we called victory over the financial crisis, and I truly think we did win over the financial crisis, came this crisis. This shows that recovery is not enough. And the second couple I will want to look at with you is recovery and resilience. That means you recover from this crisis, and what do you do to make sure that if another crisis hits, you are somewhat protected. Now, institutions normally are there exactly to give some stability and to ensure some stability. And the more of the stability they ensure, the more is the trust that they are able to command. But the trust and the stability they ensure, of course, depends very much on something which is difficult to measure, although there are many studies around the world, which is the quality of public administration. Quality is elusive, but essentially I would say is the ability to deal, to grapple with different moments of the economic cycle. There is a very beautiful paper that I have it here, very simple, 8 pages, 10 pages, by a common friend of many of us, André Sapir from Bruegel. And the paper is about why has COVID-19 hit countries' differences. If you read, the response to that is because of the different quality of public administration, which is the single biggest factor. These tell us one thing to which we need to get used. The quality of public administration matters a lot, both in the ascending phases of the crisis, when you are trying to develop, let's say, a business environment, a place which is conducive to investment, but also in the descending phases of the crisis, when you are trying to basically do some damage limitation, as essentially was the period, let's say March till June, July, damage limitation. There is very interesting, in the moment you do damage limitation, one thing with which economists for a long time have tried to give an answer, which is there something, and if there is, what it is, that there is beyond the GDP. We all remember the debate beyond the GDP. I think Sergei hinted to that for a moment. Now, what there is beyond GDP? Well, this crisis has revealed that there are lots of things beyond GDP. Most governments in the world, if not to say all, have been ready and have decided explicitly to sacrifice a big chunk of GDP in order to save life. So basically demonstrating that there is not necessarily a GDP religion. Then some were very successful, as we have heard from Anna. Some were less successful, but this is a different story. But what is, I think, in terms of revealed preferences, what is important is that they all essentially tried to go in that direction. Now, the DG, the European Commission DG reform that I have the honor to lead, helps member states with this issue, with the issue of the quality of public administration in 2 ways. Way number 1 is the most classical, which is as the text of our regulation, of the regulation we administer, which is the technical support instrument, says our job is to support member states administration to make reforms. So that is most classical. We help member states administration at various levels, either the central or the regional or independent authorities, to make reforms. And very often we do it with you and through you and thanks to you, Laurence, and the OECD. Other times we do it with other providers, but this is a part. But then there is also another part, which is making reforms for themselves. I mean, you help the public administration to do reform, but also, and they could be reforms in several different areas, but we also want to try to help public administration to improve themselves, to get stronger themselves. And I will detail it in a moment, but that is not a particularly easy task. However, is a doable task. That is one thing we want to bring. Now, in this moment, I think in order to improve, we have a rather phenomenal chance, which is the chance that the world has changed dramatically, and the multi-annual financial budget, the multi-annual financial framework that we have just adopted is nowhere close to the same one we would have adopted a year ago. Actually, the irony of history, as you know, is that in January, February, at the very beginning of the pandemic, member states did not agree on an extremely small, with respect to today, financial framework. So in a way, we were at that time, we thought to be sad, but in a way we were fortunate that there was not an agreement there, and then the new paradigm could come. And I agree very much with Sergei. Everybody immediately learned from the previous crisis. In a way, This is good. The crisis was not wasted. We were able to do the crisis. But what the crisis has brought to, and that comes my first couple, is that together with the multi-annual budget, we put forward the Next Generation EU. The Next Generation EU instrument, Recovery and Resilience Facility, is an instrument that puts a very strong intergenerational pact, as Sergei said it, and I could not say it more clear. The money will be disbursed in the next 3 years, not even, and then will be repaid from 2028 to 2058. So I blush to say how old I will be in 2058. I let you guess it, but I mean, will not be me paying, will be someone else. So it's very clear that there is an intergenerational pact. And how do you make this pact acceptable? And I think to respond to this, we need to go to the crux of what is the RRF. The Recovery and Resilience Facility, first of all, is a facility and not a fund. And the difference between a fund and a facility is that the fund pays the costs, while the facility pays the performance. So the pact that has been sealed is the following one. We get member states to submit their idea of what a national recovery and resilience plan is, and then the member states in this national recovery and resilience plan need to indicate, of course, intermediate and final targets, what we call in our jargon milestone and targets, and the facility will repay upon successful fulfillment of milestone and targets. I think this is exactly the way through which we square the couple between need for coordination and national ownership, because it's very clear reforms cannot come from or by Brussels. Reforms need to be endogenous in a way. They need to be worked in and owned and be proprietor of the national countries, and we can come on that and repay upon performance. This is essential if we want the mechanism to function, and I would say this is what was very clear during the agreement. In order to do that, and this is the second question, the question of trust and of public administration. In order to do that, we need a public administration which is probably somewhat changed with respect to the one we have entered into the crisis. You mentioned few things that have helped us to navigate through the crisis. Certainly fiscal space is one of them, I don't dispute it, certainly other things, but those countries who enter into the crisis with a strong public administration, with a public administration that, for example, was much more digital, they didn't do it probably because they thought there will be a pandemic and we need to work from home, but it's clear that they survived the crisis much better. In our guidelines and examples for the preparation of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, we give four broad areas. One is clearly the one of the digital transformation of the public sector, so the necessity to move digital as much as possible. Second is the one to make sure that moving digital doesn't mean only having computers and few things on the portals, but means to have an attractiveness for the public sector to the new generation, so that when a good student comes out from a university with a PhD or with a master, says, I want to go to work for the public administration because the public administration is attractive and dynamic. Only in that case you can get the demand and the supply effect. I mean, and again, if Anna allows me, the example she gave us today, I mean, how many civil servants in Europe in the middle of the summer would take a call between 1:30 and 3:30 at night? I think this is a fantastic display of what is a great and a strong public administration. I mean, is something that works well, digital and portal, and there's incredibly committed people that in the middle of their summer holidays, between 1:30 and 3:30 at night, work with us and tell us what to do. The third thing that we insist upon is looking at the all phases of the work of the policy administration, We have seen lots of improvement in policy making, also because of the all coordination that comes. There is the issue of implementation now. Implementation, of course, is seen always as the difficult part, because for whatever reason it comes a little bit later down the time, because a number of obstacles may enter through the proper implementation. But it's clear that is an area to which attention is needed. And the fourth one, of course, is innovation, is ability of public administration to be innovative. Reforms, as I was saying, and I'm going to close relatively soon, but the reforms of the public administration, as I was saying, is crucial both in all phases of the cycle, both when the cycle goes well and when the cycle goes badly. Now, with some luck and with the vaccines being deployed all through the world for those countries who need them, we possibly can look with some hope to some sustained recovery in the next few years and in the next few months. And that is the moment where clearly we need to support member states for that. As I said, the DG I'm working for does this program, which is the technical support instrument, and we have seen quite an increased interest and attention of member states on that. We support basically all member states, not basically, we support all member states, 27 member states, and in the area of public administration, in the last couple of years, the amount of requests and support that has been raised has increased. To conclude, I think I believe in the next few months and then for the years to come, we need very well to square the question between ownership of reform and coordination in integrated economic areas like the European Union. And we need very well to square the equation between recovery and resilience. Why? Because this crisis was so big, Laurence, you said the biggest in a century, and you are probably right, was so big, the shock was so big that there was like a sentiment that we should do something exceptional to fight. But we cannot do something exceptional every time. And we know that there are other hazards. I haven't mentioned the green issue, for example. But we know that climate, environment, and so on and on may bring other hazards. So I think we need to have the recovery out, but also the resilience. You mentioned the pandemic plans that all countries had. I think we need to have that and to prepare much more for that. Thank you very much for the occasion.
Thank you, Mario. That was truly comprehensive and enlightening and bring a lot of questions about, I think one of the things which really struck me is how you insisted on improving or increasing the attractiveness of public administration. And before I pass the floor to Alan, I have some homework for you to do and prepare a response to some question that we talked about this, and this is something that we exchange a lot with Elsa, who's heading government, which is, public spending and quality of public spending. And Anna and Sergey insisted on how governments have to deliver what they have promised. Yes, in the past, there has been many review of public spending. And to the best of my knowledge, in Europe, they've often resulted in tension between the population and the committee in charge of this review, or between the committee in charge of the review and the government who had appointed the committee. But clearly, this is not something that we can acknowledge has worked for all. In fact, only Canada has managed to do that in a very efficient way in the 90s. And also, I think there was strong ownership from the ministers, and perhaps Alan will say a word about this. But the question for you, Mario, is what lessons can we learn from those past exercises that you know very well, what was missing? How can we improve from this to make it a success when we actually think about public finances which are resilient for future shock? So now that I've given you some homework, let me introduce Alan Sutherland, who's been patiently waiting, so not as patiently as Jacob, just after you.
Well, he left.
Yeah, he gave up on us. So you've been Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet Machinery of Government with the Privy Council Office since May 2014. You had some additional duties for democratic institution since September 2016. You've got the very tough job of providing advice to the Prime Minister on the structure and organization of the government, which is a very good transition with the previous discussion we had, and that includes obviously cabinet decision-making process, interpretation, application of the constitutional principles, and many other things. Like for Mario, if you excuse me, you have such an impressive career that I will refrain from listing everything that you've done, but we'll obviously move to ask you a few questions. And in particular, I mean, I was mentioning Canada's spending review, but really, if we can start with how Canada has handled the health crisis to start with, and I think how the Canadian government has managed to maintain trust. Canada is also very impressive, not only in contact tracing, the strength of the isolation process and the speed of vaccination, and also the strength, I think, of the governing process for this. So there are many things that we can learn from you. And it's not so early now for you to speak.
No, it was good that you waited. Thank you very much, Laurence. It's too kind. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak on this important subject. Canada has, as you said, Laurence, has had a full pandemic. We haven't performed the way New Zealand has, but I think there are some things that we got right. There's a Dutch saying which goes, trust comes in on foot, but leaves on horseback. And what that means is that trust is earned very slowly, but it can be lost very quickly. Secretary Gurria, in his remarks, mentioned the Edelman Trust Index and the long-term decline in trust in most countries. I think it's still fair to say that in Canada and in many other countries that citizens still that in times of crisis, citizens are still willing to put their trust in government. They will rally around the flag. I think we've seen that in many countries. The real question is whether they will continue to put their trust in government in a crisis. And I think that ultimately depends on performance, including effective communications, which are essential to maintaining, in a modern democracy, citizens' trust. So, turning to the issue of maintaining and building trust in a democracy, I have 4 points I'd like to lead with, and we can see where it goes from there. My first point is that in a crisis, citizens have no patience for political infighting. So governments need to show that they are working together, that they have their governance act together, and that in countries such as Canada, and I think also Germany and Australia come to mind, what we've seen is that in their pandemic responses, these federal states have been able to work pretty seamlessly from one level of government to another. We've also seen it in places where, countries that maybe are unitary states, but which have reached down to the local level. And Italy comes to mind. They were hit hard by the pandemic, but they did do that engagement at the local level. So in terms of the governance response, I think there are several layers to it. Like the multi-layer governance that takes place can occur within a government. So bringing together, the full breadth of the federal government to apply itself to what is a very complex crisis with, as has been said by Mario and Sergey and others, it has an economic dimension, it has a social dimension, it has a border dimension, and all of these areas need to be brought together in an effective way. In Canada, what we saw was the creation of an ad hoc cabinet committee on COVID-19. It met 55 times, over 130 hours of deliberations. We had cabinet meetings where COVID-19 was a standing item. This speaks to bringing together a whole of government response. There's also a need to reach across the aisle. So in Canada, that's actually pretty hard because it's a minority government. But reaching across the aisle to the opposition leaders, making sure they have the information they need to understand what is taking place in the crisis. The way we did it in Canada is we provided technical brief after technical brief to parliamentarians until they ran out of questions. And so that's how we addressed that. There's also engagement with other orders of government. Here, I think Australia is a tremendous example. They actually created a new mechanism. They created a national cabinet. It met 30 times. The national cabinet consisted of Prime Minister Morrison and the premiers of the different state governments, and was a very effective mechanism. In Canada, we have what we call a First Ministers meeting, which is the Prime Minister and premiers. It met 24 times and was instrumental in making sure that the seamless government response was possible. There's also internationally, so Canada and the United States, we cooperated on border controls, and I think that that was really important to our effective response. There is a saying, an American saying that came out of Hurricane Katrina, which I think is really important here, which is you should never try and exchange business cards during a hurricane. And what we're saying there is that these governance habits, these mechanisms need to exist before the crisis. It's really hard to create cooperation in a crisis moment. So I think that that is a big takeaway. I think, Laurence, you challenged me to talk a little bit about Canada's fiscal response. One of the early lessons that we drew on from the financial crisis was the need to establish confidence in the market. So we saw on March 13th of last year, 2 days before the WHO declared a pandemic, we saw the Minister of Finance, we saw the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and we saw the Superintendent of Financial Institutions appear at a joint press conference. One purpose to the press conference: express confidence in the market, a commitment to provide stimulus, a commitment for easy credit. And what it did was it helped stabilize the markets in Canada. My second point is on a democratic citizenry's expectations and demands for information. They're much higher than they've ever been. Like, in that sense, I think government is more challenging than it's been. We discussed this a lot actually in the PGC meeting in the fall, and here the lesson that was gathered was communicate, communicate, communicate. And I think Hannah Cameron mentioned it well with Prime Minister Ardern providing some very good personal leadership, being out there, delivering the information, telling New Zealanders what she knew, what she didn't know, where they were, what the plan was. Same thing happened in Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau appeared before Canadians. His daily press briefings were must-see TV across the country, where he just kind of expressed, like, here's what we know, here's how it's impacting, here are the numbers, here's why you need to take this or that action. And it was really important for establishing that connection with citizens. The other thing that he did that I think was really important is he validated the science and the evidence. So he often appeared with the Chief Public Health Officer, implicitly validating the expert opinion and making sure that the science was brought to bear to Canada's response to the crisis. A third thing, and I think this draws on something Professor Guriev was mentioning about the need to reach out to those left behind, the need to reach out to vulnerable groups. In Canada, we've got a very nuanced strategy to reach out to groups that are traditionally excluded. It's been a focus of the Canadian response. And I think here we're actually drawing extensively on the Black Lives Matter movement and the need to reach out to groups, whether it's persons of color, immigrant groups, Indigenous groups, groups that may historically have reason to doubt what government tells them, but reaching out in a nuanced way with them, having focus groups, seeing what messages get through, and also translation into, we're translating our government messages into 30 languages. We have videos, like both television and online media in 16 languages in order to reach all parts of Canadian society so that there's no one left behind. So that's my second message. The third one we've kind of talked about, which is that democratic citizens expect world-class government, and they know what's happening in other countries, and they want to have it in their country. So I think the challenge here is like understanding what world-class government looks like. And for us in Canada, this is often being a fast follower, trying to take the best ideas wherever they are and adapting them to the Canadian context. And if I could just do a quick shout out to the OECD, this is an area of tremendous value added of the OECD. Taking different country responses, looking at kind of the comparative dimension, what works, what's the best way to approach things, and kind of just see where one country stands versus the other. We may not always like the answers we get because, you know, maybe we're behind New Zealand, we know that, but we need to listen to kind of the serious-minded messages that we hear from the OECD. I'd also provide just kind of a caution, because I think we're at a dangerous stage in the pandemic. I mean, we've had, I think, people the world over experiencing COVID fatigue. I think that, you know, the relief at having developed a vaccine in like astonishing times is giving way to concern about, well, when do I actually get the vaccine? So all the heroic efforts during the pandemic crisis, we don't want them to go to waste. And we don't want to lose citizen confidence because the rollout isn't as effective as it needs to be. So if, you know, being Canadian, I think what I'll do is I'll draw on a hockey metaphor here. I think people might expect that of me. And that is, public servants need to understand that they're only as good as their last shift, and that what's happening to the end of the crisis is something that citizens will remember, and it's important that we get the rollout right so that we don't risk losing the confidence of our citizens, who have actually, as magnificent as governments have been, citizens have been magnificent too, by and large, right? They've sacrificed an awful lot, and we owe it to them to get the vaccine rollout right. I would mention as my final point that citizen expectations are evolving, and I would say that that's a good thing. So government has demonstrated in the pandemic that it can work faster, it can be more responsive than anyone expected. I think around the world, those in the system are quite surprised at our ability to get out stimulus checks, secure the borders, the public health rollout. It's just been a tremendous effort. We've also been able to organize ourselves seamlessly. We've managed to get our act together. And I think that this sets a new normal for citizen expectations. I don't know whether you've experienced this in your country, but I know our Prime Minister has turned to us and said, well, that's great, you can do that for a pandemic. What about other situations? What about climate change? What about issues around inclusion? Why can't we have the same sort of urgency, commitment, and kind of transformational approach that we saw during the crisis? Why can't we apply it to other issues? So I think citizens will be inclined to act similarly. Our head civil servant, the clerk of the Privy Council, has likened the government response to being like a rubber band. Government was able to stretch, to adapt. It's shown it can stretch to adapt to the crisis. The question is, what are those things that it's done during the crisis that it needs to continue doing, and what things need to kind of go back to normal? And I think really his challenge to civil servants is, what are the things that we need to continue to do, which become new best practices? And the sorts of things that he's looked at are things like procurement, where we've, you know, the purchasing of PPE, the compressed timelines around procurement, IT transformation for some of the stimulus checks. Data sharing was another area. Remote work, many of us are working remotely. How does the workplace look in the future? These are all among many areas that deserve a hard rethink about what normal should look like going forward. And I think that, you know, I think there is sort of a commitment and an expectation among citizens, the level of service and the level of mobilization that you've seen from government in a crisis has to be the new normal, and the expectations, I think, will rise. I think that's a good thing for the public service. We want to be in such a dynamic workplace. And it just goes to the need to continue to reform, to continue to build best practices, and to continue to get better. So with that, I will end it, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. All of you have been super impressive, but each time what's even more impressive, we're learning something for which we're very grateful. And thanks for sharing not only Canadian experience, but also having a vision for the future as well. I think you're right, people will expect very much the same type of service afterwards, or better service afterwards in some cases. And another impressive country has obviously been Germany. So Jakob, thanks for your patience, that of having waited for everybody to actually speak. Jakob has the experience of being both he's many things, but among these many things, a world-class economist, a policymaker at the Ministry of Finance, and he's been through the fire of being a parliamentarian as well. So I think you've seen it all over the past few years, Jakob, and we're very grateful that you're taking some of your time at the Ministry of Finance to discuss with us how Germany has handled the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the level of trust, at least, in popular votes, that Germans have shown in their government has always been very impressive, and it has certainly not receded, at least from the outside, during this crisis. And communications also very special in Germany, and perhaps one would have thought that being federal would complexify things, but you seem to have demonstrated that in fact it seems to have eased consensus. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and the many presentations that were made very much resonate, frankly, with our experience, both in terms of what has gone right, but also in terms of what perhaps hasn't gone as well as it could have, compared to other countries. Since so many good things have been said, I want to do two things. First, I want to remind us why trust really goes to the heart of the problem. And then I want to talk about certain aspects of trust between different parts of society. So why does trust go to the heart of this specific problem? First of all, because of the nature of the threat. It's a threat that obviously can't be seen. It is a threat that's lethal, but with a relatively low probability to most people. Low probability is always a problem. There's exponential dynamics. That's difficult to grasp. There's poor initial evidence on the main drivers of the spread. It's overall a threat that can only be understood by experts. So there's huge information asymmetry. And of course, because it's also new, experts change their mind all the time, because of course the evidence changes, which is also confusing to people who talk to experts. So this is, in many ways, is the perfect storm. And what makes things much, much worse, if you will, it's bad enough. But in addition, of course, there's massive, what as economists we would call market failure. The sum of individual actions leads to very bad outcomes, especially, of course, if individuals are then, in addition, not well informed. But even if they were, which they never are, nobody is ever perfectly, but even if they were perfectly informed, the outcome would still be bad, because in infections, you get these massive externalities. So we require really government action in many respects, including when it comes to civil liberties, on an unprecedented scale in recent history. And so you have this big problem of something that is really, really hard to grasp for the general public, and the need for massive government intervention on all levels. And so I agree with everything that has been said by Alan, by Mario, by Hannah, about quality of public service and so on. But in normal times, sometimes we get away with mediocre, as long as the public service somehow works, it's okay. But this is massive, and at the core of it, we have the trust problem. And so in an ideal world, of course, we would have to have a trustful relationship between citizens and governments. We would have a trustful relationship between citizens and experts. And of course, a trustful relationship between the scientific community and the government. And it's been alluded to by Laurence, among others before, also a trustful relationship between countries, which is very hard in a challenging situation like the present one. And of course, none of these relationships, they're perfect, and trust is often lacking. And I want to agree entirely with Sergey. Of course, you know, if you have a transparent government in normal times, efficient civil service, in short, a democracy with a functional public service and a welfare state, you're off to a good start, obviously. I think that leads me to something that we've experienced in a way firsthand in Germany, in Berlin. It's something what I would call the Leviathan paradox. If your government is a Leviathan, if it's a dictatorship, in a way, part of the trust problem goes away. You just need to tell people what to do, and you can observe whether they roam around or not. I'm very glad none of us comes from lives in a Leviathan country. But in a Leviathan world, the trust problem is of a different nature. But and of course, if everything works, sort of New Zealand model, if everybody not only lives in a functioning democracy, but is aware that it is in fact a functioning democracy and things are well, you're fine as well. A real problem emerges when in fact you live in a liberal democracy, but people imagine for fanciful reasons that it is otherwise, that somehow the government in reality is a Leviathan and secretly schemes to dominate them. And of course that creates huge problems. And we saw it in many countries, but we did see it in Germany. We had these massive demonstrations by people who were frankly ill-informed and who had this impression they were living in a new kind of dictatorship that let them freely demonstrate. And of course, part of the problem disappeared when some of the major leaders of this movement then all of a sudden had a COVID infection and realized that perhaps the problem was more serious than originally imagined. But I think this problem of what I would call the Leviathan paradox, it's very real. And probably there are no shortcuts. Probably this had to play out. You know, you had to allow these demonstrations. Probably they led to a little bit more infection. But, you know, what's the alternative? And so there's certain mistakes and delusions that probably need to run their course. And if trust generally is sufficiently strong, we can live with it. But it was unfortunate, and it did play a role in Germany, and I believe it did play a role in many different ways in other countries. So that's the Leviathan paradox. I want to move, Laurence, to something that you've mentioned, which is the question of federalism and trust. And federalism, on one level, is very good for trust, in the sense that it forces a central government. And as we speak, we have this meeting between the central government in Germany and the regional governments, the regional prime ministers. And the regional prime ministers on lockdown, they basically have all the powers. So they really need to be convinced, which means that the central government has the challenge of communicating with all the different regions, with different characteristics, with different groups that play a huge role in a way that is conducive to this consensus. And in doing so, it is forced to develop not only insights, but ways of communicating those insights that are suitable for a wide variety of setups, including measures. As was said, different parts of the population, different parts of the countries, everybody needs to be on board. Sometimes that gets more expensive. It certainly slows you down, and I'll come to that in a minute, but it means that the communication, if you will, within government and federalism is almost akin to the kind of communication you need with your citizens. And so it forces you to have people on board. And that's the good news. And that's conducive to trust. And it's certainly a strength of a federal system like the one in Germany. And to some extent, of course, Mario, at the European level. But there is, of course, a downside. And the downside is federalism takes time. And is not very good at taking quick action and decisive action. And in a crisis like the present, that also comes at a cost. And I think we need to be honest about it. It comes at a cost in Germany. It comes as a cost, Maria, in Europe. So we can't say it's an unmitigated advantage. And there's an upside to it, and there's a downside to it. And I think in all federal countries, a very interesting question will be raised, and the EU, very interesting question will be raised. Where are the areas where federalism in the current sense works very well? And where are the areas where maybe we need to reform our system a little bit in order to make it work even a little bit better in the future? But I think by and large, federalism is conducive to trust, but if federalism doesn't deliver, it starts to be a problem when it comes to trust, because you can compare to other countries, and if you don't do so well, and people have the impression, well, it's because you were really, really slow, it's a problem. So I think that's something we see a lot in Germany, probably on balance a good thing, especially in larger countries. I think it's difficult to run a larger country without federalism. Alan, Canada is a very good example for that, and it's difficult to run Germany. But I think we need to be aware that this is ambiguous. Then from the German experience, there was a lot of talk, for good reason, about transparency and data. I think transparency, yes, we'll learn a little bit, and have learned a little bit as we went along, infection numbers and so on. Initially, transparency wasn't as good as it is now. But on data availability, we really look to other countries, including Laurence, France, by the way, where in many areas data availability, real-time data availability is a lot better. And that's an area where we feel if in the next crisis we're better in that dimension, it will be good for trust, and it will be good for more precise government intervention. So data and real-time data is a big issue. We're making some progress. Our statistical office is really starting to do wonders in that domain, but we still have a long way to go. I think this whole question of science and democracy is brought to a fore by this crisis, and it's very related to the kind of questions on science and democracy you have with global warming and some other areas, where I think we're doing all right, partly because of our education system, partly because generally people they don't believe they're absolute truths. That's helpful because science moves. That's a good thing. They don't believe things mustn't be questioned. So that's a good thing. But at the same time, there's a sort of pragmatic sort of engineering belief, as long as science works, we better work with it rather than try to work against it. So I think from what I can see in Germany, it's a fairly healthy relationship of the mainstream with the way you treat scientific evidence in policy making and public decision making. But there's some parts of the population where maybe that's a significant challenge as well. Just briefly on the international dimension, I think in Europe with Next Generation EU, we really did take a big step in order to assure that there would be better levels of trust between countries. And that's very good news. At the international level, frankly, I do not understand why it is not possible right now to fully fund the necessary international vaccine programs, because while of course many countries imagine their islands in this crisis, only very few countries are islands, and even countries which are islands don't want to be isolated. We want to be able to open up again, and the requirement for that is to make sure that our international efforts for countries with less resources, frankly, are properly funded. And I think if we don't manage to do that, we'll have a massive trust problem internationally. I want to finish with a thought that is delicate, but I think very important. In a challenging, dynamic environment with all these problems of information and the permeation of that information, in the spread of that information in society, I think in the end, what is critical is the question of how one deals with mistakes. Because mistakes will be made. They will always be made in a situation like that. And with the best intentions, sometimes not with, but with best intentions, mistakes will be made. And the question of how you deal with those mistakes, that's true for a working relationship among colleagues. When you really start trusting people, as if you understand they deal well with mistakes. And that's also true for citizens and governments. And if we are good at dealing with mistakes, I think we'll be fine. And if we're not, we are asking for trouble. And we still have a very challenging year ahead. So I hope we can live up to the challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Jakob. I think that was very, very insightful, and you know, your assessment of federalism, I think, was definitely very, very helpful. As well as the question of ownership, which I think is also particularly relevant when we talk about the European Union, right? Blame Brussels and get praise for what's happening at home has been a long-standing game, which I'm sure Mario can even smile about now. And the question on data availability will definitely be crucial, as well as mistakes. So I've talked too much. In the previous, before the break, we had a question from Malcolm Katrak from a university in India. I don't know if Malcolm wants to ask his question now. And what would be nice is please introduce yourself and put your camera on so that the panelists can see you, if possible.
Sure. Hi, am I audible?
You're perfectly audible, not visible.
Okay, okay, I'm not sure if I don't think I have the option of switching on my camera right now.
Okay.
So I think I'll just ask my question. So hi, I'm a lecturer at Jindal University in India. And thank you so much for the panelists. It was quite insightful. So I study trust from a legal perspective and from a multilateralism perspective as well. So I think my question is mainly directed to Jakob. So quite recently, I think the Alliance for Multilateralism was formed by Germany and France. So do you think that for vaccines to be public goods, there should be a trust in the institutions or trust in the multilateralism of sorts, especially when there are populist governments moving towards unilateralism? And if there is a decline of trust in an institution like WHO, then how do countries facilitate or increase that trust in, say, multilateralism to make the vaccines as public goods?
I don't know if any of you wants to pick up this question.
I'm happy to very briefly try and do that. First of all, to be very precise, my observation was principally about funding. I think it's very good that we are creating the kind of demand which we are creating for all the vaccines that are being developed, so that the production is really rolled out. But we also need to make certain that the vaccines, when they're produced on this massive scale, reach all parts of the world. And for that, we have a certain funding vehicle, COVAX, ACT, and so on. I don't want to go into the details. And unfortunately, these vehicles, they're not yet fully funded. And there are excellent studies, including by the OECD, as Laurence recently reminded me, of how in economic terms, let alone the many lives that we can save by doing that, this is just an incredibly good deal. And it would be a colossal failure if we don't fund at the international level this rollout of the vaccination worldwide. And that's what we need to do. What I said really was about, if you will, fundraising. But you're absolutely right that the money in itself is not enough. One needs to make certain that at the international level, and then breaking it down to the national and regional level, and you're from India, a very large country, that's enormously challenging. And we also need to make certain that the multilateral actors, as well as the regional, national and regional actors, they're up to the task. But without money, frankly, all the rest will be very, very hard. And even with enough funds, it will be a hard challenge, but I think we can manage.
Thanks. I think I would just add to what Jakob has been saying, that the amount that's needed is probably less than 100 billion to vaccine the entire world. And when you look at the amount of fiscal spending that each month of lockdown is costing the global economy, it's really, it's more than micro. I mean, it's dwarfing, the fiscal spending are dwarfing what we need for the vaccine. So, and we will continue to repeat it until, you know, education is repetition, somebody said. So a couple more questions, because some of our panelists have to go. We have one question about the role of, so how you see, perhaps that's for Sergey, but anybody can take it up, the role of social media and fake news, how to regulate them, should we regulate them, and how? And I have another question from the audience about the issue of poor trust between countries. And in a way, Jakob has replied with the vaccine, but the question is also about sovereign credit ratings and whether that plays a role between countries. I don't know who wants to take that up.
Perhaps I'll take on the social media question, if that's okay. I'll take it in the form of disinformation. So we've seen a startling rise in, sometimes it's called the infodemic of disinformation that's occurred, anti-vaxxers, vaccine hesitancy. I think there's a broad obligation of the government to just get information out there, to address it, fill the information void. I think that what's made it particularly challenging is that some of the groups that engage in disinformation are not mainstream. And so how do you reach them? I think it does include direct engagement of social media companies. We've seen some remarkable things happen in the United States in recent weeks about their willingness to address disinformation. So we've seen an important change. Certainly what seems possible now is a lot different than what seemed possible even a couple months ago. So the field is evolving rapidly, but I think there has to be a direct discussion between government and the social media companies to kind of address issues around disinformation. I think there has to be a fair bit of pre-bunking. Every society has some cleavages in it that can be exploited. And so getting information out that addresses some of those sensitivities in every country, I think government and in fact civil society need to do a better job of kind of addressing those cleavages, trying to neutralize it with better quality information. I think that there is a kind of an ecosystem of information that needs to be drawn on. It includes media, includes academia, includes community groups. I think there has to be a special effort reaching out to vulnerable groups, reaching out to marginalized groups to ensure that they don't get radicalized and don't kind of fall under the sway of disinformation, including, like in this case, anti-vaxxing. So I think that we've made some steps, but it's a new issue for government. I don't think we've ever seen this on this kind of scale. So I think that there's a lot of, there remains a lot of creative policy work in terms of getting the message out, but also perhaps in the regulatory space needs to be considered very seriously.
Maybe let me
Well,
give
and
my...
I think somebody has to speak muted once in Mario, you wanted to talk?
Yes, if possible, let me give just my perspective on the issue of coordination and relations of poor trust between countries and so on and on. If you think the crisis we have been through, every crisis we had did something. We basically came out of the 2008 global financial crisis with rules. So essentially supply side intervention, demand side remained what it was. Then from the euro area crisis in 2012, 2014, we supplemented rules with essentially Juncker plan, investment plans. So we added the investment dimension. Then we saw that the investment dimension, as you said in the question you posed to me in the break, was not enough because of what the economists call total factor productivity, and therefore we needed more reform in order to make the investment stronger. And then I think the learning of this crisis is the coordination thing, is the fact that the old game that Sergei and you refer to, blame Brussels and take merit, simply did not work because, for example, even for the procurement of the vaccines, we did procure much better at the European level, where we procured 2.3 billion doses. So there has been probably the virtues of the coordination. Completely agree with Jakob. There has been, now is visible the upside. At some moment there will be the downside, and you hear it also in the simple discourse. For example, now that there is a little reduction in the distribution of vaccines, it immediately has become, but why there are less? And you have to say less with respect to what? Probably to what you would have been able to procure infinitely more. Less with respect to what has been said a few days ago. So I think there is, every time we learn a crisis, every time through the crisis we learn something, investment, reforms, coordination. But what we also learn is that that is not the last thing that we have learned. Probably through this crisis we will learn something else. And I think, I think the equation that is really big in our heads between the coordination and the national ownership is one where we haven't yet solved it, and the one that we need to look at that.
If I could build on that, and I'd be interested in Jakob's sense of this as a fellow federal state. It's the oldest game in federalism to blame the other level of government, and it's one that increasingly citizens see through. And so part of what we've seen in the pandemic is we've seen the remarkable situation where you have a federal government, which is liberal, partnering with provincial governments, which are conservative, which are labor, some which have a green tinge to them. And they're all kind of coordinated together because they realize there's not really any space for criticism, or the space is just at the margins. And I think that's actually been very helpful for trust, because I may not trust the federal government because I'm a conservative, but my provincial government is a conservative government. So when you see politicians of different stripes working together, I think it does reinforce trust. And conversely, we have seen, complaining at the edges between levels of government, a little bit of sniping, and really it hasn't had a momentum. It hasn't gained a lot of citizen trust. In fact, there's been a lot of, well, like, what are they doing? We're supposed to be in this together. It's supposed to be a Team Canada approach. So I don't think there's a lot of space for that sort of sniping, but I'd be interested in what Jakob had to say about this.
If it's all right, I'll come in very briefly. I agree with you in terms of sending the signal. We're in this together, and very different sort of political ideologies come together and basically buy into the same thing. And that's very much conducive to trust. And so I agree on that level. I think secondly, to the extent that there is wiggle room in the regions and they try out different things and sometimes succeed and sometimes fail, I think that can also help build trust. in terms of creating empirical evidence of what works and what doesn't, even very close to home. And so I think that's also good news about federalism. There's this one problem though, and I think, I don't know whether it's like that in Canada, but in Germany, we can certainly say that decision-making becomes a little bit slower. When perhaps decisions need to be taken fast or need to be reversed or amended, then the federal system sometimes reaches its limits and sometimes also restricts the degree to which a federal government, for example, can be very clear about what needs to be done. Because sometimes there's a concern that if you tell people what really needs to be done, then it's afterwards impossible to reach a consensus with the regions. And then you stand there having said you wanted to do one thing and you end up with something different. And that's bad for trust too. So I think we mustn't underestimate the extent to which federalism can also create inertia. So I would really insist on that point. We really have both. We have a big advantage for trust thanks to federalism, and we also do have a downside. And I think we need to be honest about it as well.
Thank you. So Elsa has the privilege to conclude, which means that I'm going to let her the floor. But before that, I just wanted to really warmly thank all of you for your engagement, for the passionate discussion. Anna, once again, for the very late night. But I think it's been terribly insightful, and we've learned a lot. I think it's been a fantastic discussion, in fact. So thanks very much. I hope to see you soon in real life. Bye, Mario, who's got to go, and Elsa, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Laurence, and thank you very much to the five fantastic speakers that we've had today. And thank you, Laurence, for your great moderation of this panel. As you know, I mean, we've already said, this is the last and final installment of our OECD's 5-part series. So I will try to conclude on the whole series, but I've taken also many notes from today because you have added a lot to what was already discussed. So forgive me if I'm a little bit, if that might be a little bit messy, but I think it was so rich and so interesting that you could have gone much longer, probably with the exception of Hannah, who really needs to go and have a nice night. In many ways, and I will try to sum up a little bit at the beginning, what Jakob mentioned, this crisis is really a test case for governments, given the importance of government intervention in the economy and in our democracies. It's even more the case so in liberal democracies, where, of course, gaining trust is more difficult than in other political systems. And we have seen, of course, and we can all agree that we have seen many examples of difficulties with trust in institutions where it's been very costly for the health situation, but also for the economy, but also, it hasn't been mentioned much today, but I think we all have the example of the recent example of the United States. It can be very costly for the democratic system as well. So if I want to summarize, we have 4 big lessons learned over over the series. The first one is the importance of open, transparent, and inclusive decision-making in the recovery. Let me emphasize that I'm not touching on the lessons for the public policies in terms of like what type of economic recovery, but really on the institution, on the governance of trust. So not only do recovery measures need to be targeted, of course, at the most vulnerable and those that are the hardest hit by the crisis, and I think Sergei here actually reminded us of the big risk of not doing so with the rise of populism. But also the process by which governments arrive at those decisions will also be vital. Here I would like to take some results from a 2018 survey that matter. It's an OECD survey in which 60% of people say that government does not incorporate the views of the people like them when designing social policies. And of course, the present situation that we have today requires, of course, in that context, strengthening accountability mechanisms of national governments and making sure that policy-making processes are transparent and effective. And here I'm drawing the link with the notion that Alan mentioned about engaging with a very big variety of stakeholders. We will need competent, effective, agile and innovative public administrations to deliver ambitious recovery projects. And here, same thing, I'm linking that to the notion that Mario Nova wrote about the quality of public administration as core to the management of the crisis, and the need to build on the enormous improvements that have taken place on service delivery during the crisis, and to make sure that we also that administrations are up to the new expectations from governments that have arisen from the crisis. This is also coming from Alan. Second lesson, the importance of communication. And here I would like also to draw on what Hannah has mentioned about the need to remind ourselves that trust is not a given and that it needs investment. And that's the notion of anticipating on trust. The role of government communication has been at the very center of many of the successes and the failures of managing this pandemic. Another piece of data that I want to give, according to the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, 76% of respondents worry that fake news can be used as weapons. I think it's clear that institutions will need to develop timely, clear, simple, consistent messages to avoid misinformation, and also develop the governance mechanisms to redress the significant role played by disinformation, of course, particularly in the digital space. And here I want to refer to the notion of the direct discussion between government and social media, or wider media at large, that Alan is promoting. And of course, at the OECD, we will need to look at how we can better support governments to do this. The third lesson is the importance of governments demonstrating that they have the capacity to tackle key domestic and global challenges. The results of our work in Finland and Korea show that trust in national governments is largely explained by the perceived capacity of national governments to address global challenges such as the current pandemic, but also climate change, and also things such as shaping the digital economy. And here, of course, the capacity of governments is not yet fully existent. And I want to draw again to what Mario Nova mentioned about the coordination, the need for both coordination or, global policy discussion, but also global standards, global solutions, and the national ownership. And this discrepancy is complicated. For example, we're working on essential goods now, on global solutions to the issue of essential goods, but at the end of the day, it is national governments who are accountable to their people in the provision of essential goods. And the fourth and the last conclusion, and by no means the least, is the importance of evidence. And that we need much, much more of it, and that our governments need much more of it. This crisis has been a remarkable example of the importance of having timely, accurate, and meaningful data to inform decision-making. This is something that we're looking at closely with our big work stream on data-driven governments. There's also everything that is relating to the importance of science in decision-making. But I also want to emphasize that we still have major gaps in understanding how people come to trust governments and how populations perceive, experience, and evaluate their institutions. And the very big challenges that are present today, and that may be different according to the groups, according to the levels of government, national, local, regional, or that can be across countries. And here, for example, our data show that in terms of the main drivers of trust, it seems that at local level, it is social capital and the ability to voice concerns that matter the most, while at national level, it is service responsiveness and the capacity of institutions to address future shocks. So that I want to link that also to the very important notion that that Hannah mentioned about public service ethics, because it is also something that comes out strongly at national level in terms of the drivers of trust. Again, I mean, this was a fantastic conversation. We will follow up at the OECD. We will continue to work on that more than before. We will link that to the issue also of democracy that is in difficulty in some settings right now. I would like again to thank all participants, all speakers, all moderators that have participated in today's and in previous seminars. I would also like to thank the team in the Public Governance Directorate, and especially Monica Brezzi and her team for the excellent work over the past months. And of course, we will continue on expanding on the main findings, which will serve as a roadmap for our work in the days, months, and years to come. Thank you very much.